Hello again. This presentation, like the one detailing acquisitions by year, is pretty dry. I'm going to look at the rather unusual convergence of electoral cycles in Australia, the United Kingdom and America, and the impact they have upon Australian defence acquisition, and not just AUKUS. In the final analysis, the year of greatest risk to the success of AUKUS is 2930. Should it fall over, the cost to Australia will be immense. In fact, it will be such a disaster that the tremendous cost of the failed submarine agreement with France will look like a drop in the bucket. I'm interested in your opinions on this analysis. Also note that I'm not making any recommendations about most of our political parties' policies. I'm not going to take part in the tremendous political divide that exists in Australia. Its defence is too important. I will state at the beginning that it is my belief that there are good people on both sides of politics who want to do their best for the defence of Australia. However, there are two provisos. One is that they can only work within the constraints of their political parties, Parliament, and with our bureaucracy, and the other is that absolutely none of them are found in the Greens Party. So if the last part of that statement offends you, stop watching now. Let me start off with one simple, undeniable fact. The AUKUS program, whether you agree with it or not, is absolutely crucial to Australia's strategic policy for the next quarter of a century. It is the heart and soul of the Defence Strategic Review, and the DSR left us with neither an alternative nor even the opportunity of a discussion should the AUKUS program fail. It is now equally crucial to discuss the risks that could cause the program to fail so that we can try and overcome them, because the worst case scenario is that the program actually does fall off a cliff in 2030 and Australia is left bereft of a valid strategic policy while having an ADF structured for the wrong war. This chart forms the basis of what I shall be discussing in this presentation. I started tinkering with its data when I did the original presentation on acquisitions, but it added far too much detail to that presentation. I have now returned to acquisitions. To me, it is readily apparent that AUKUS and the Australian Defence Procurement Program is facing a total collapse by the end of this decade. This chart shows a frightening timeline developing out of a mix of elections, personalities, financial pressures and procurement decisions that will prove especially disastrous for the Royal Australian Navy. I'll end the presentation with a statement and a question. Firstly, I will look at the structure of the Royal Australian Navy, both best and worst case. Then I will ask a question that no one else appears to have even given a thought. I'm going to start off with a few simple graphs to show some of the financial costs and actual benefits for the AUKUS program, not just for Australia, but also for our two partners. The left-hand side shows who is paying the cost for AUKUS. The right-hand side shows any financial gains from the program. Each square represents $5 billion, each row $50 billion. As you can see, almost all the financial costs are borne by Australia, with the UK coming in second. You'll see a line for the UK's Astute program. I'll talk more about the Astutes later. At the moment, it is just there for comparison. There is a $5 billion financial benefit to both the USA and UK from Australian investments in their shipyards under the AUKUS program. These payments are already happening. In terms of build costs, Australia is budgeting $9 billion per year once we start actually building the submarines. With a build of one sub every 2 years, I've doubled that to around $20 billion for the estimated cost of an AUKUS submarine. The $30 billion represents the total program cost per boat, and this could increase quite dramatically should we not get at least 12 AUKUS submarines. I have actually halved the production cost for the UK because it already has the capacity to build their Astute class submarines. There is probably a decent saving in the UK as they also do not have to invest as much as Australia in training and manufacturing. But there are no firm figures I could find for the estimated UK cost per AUKUS submarine, so this is a very generous guess for the Brits. The American financial benefits drop if they don't sell us the Virginias. I've set the sale price at $5 billion each, or about 2/3 the cost of a new boat. The sale of old boats to Australia will offset the cost of new boats for the United States Navy, so that is a big plus in going ahead. But if they don't have the shipbuilding capacity, it is probably irrelevant. I'll also talk about this later. There should be no surprise that Australia is carrying, by a long, long way, the greater financial cost of the AUKUS program. Now it's going to get interesting. In the presentation, I note that crunch time for the AUKUS program is 2030. One of the reasons is financial. If the AUKUS program is shut down in 2030, the cost rewards analysis is quite remarkable and decidedly detrimental to Australia. It will have cost Australia around $40 billion, while the US and UK would actually be in credit. The UK in 2030 will not have started building an AUKUS submarine, and their costs till then are really quite minimal, and I'll discuss that later. Of course, AUKUS is far more than just money. There is also an industrial and technological side to the agreement. The UK Defence Journal listed several technological benefits of AUKUS for the Royal Navy. To that I've added a sovereign shipbuilding capacity, but of course the UK already has one in the form of their Astute class. Their Astute submarines already have the Tomahawks, so I haven't listed it as a benefit for the Royal Navy. The Americans will get the evolved combat system regardless of AUKUS, so there are actually no benefits to the US Navy at all, apart from the not insignificant benefit of our submarines integration with theirs. Of course, that is offset by the loss of different capabilities, as an example, that are provided by the Royal Australian Navy's diesel boats. Note that the UK already has the industrial base to build reactors for the Astute submarines, but are expanding it to also build the bigger reactors for its Dreadnought program. That was happening regardless of AUKUS, but I've listed here because it was announced as a benefit to the UK of this program. The obvious big winner here is Australia. This is what it looks like if AUKUS is shut down in 2030. The only thing the British will miss out on is the VLS, which, as I will discuss later, will not significantly hurt the Royal Navy's core responsibilities for the next decade. The combat management system is debatable. I'll leave that discussion to others. Obviously, the only real technological loser if the AUKUS program collapses in 2030 is Australia. 6 months ago, when I prepared the presentation on defence procurement, I included Australia's purchase of the Virginia-class submarines in that procurement pipeline. I also noted that it was extremely unlikely that we would get them due to production delays, and that's despite Australia investing nearly $5 billion in American shipyards. It's money that we will never get a return on because the ongoing delays in production means that the US Navy cannot spare the Virginias we need. My concerns have been realised within days of the start of 2025. Widespread media reports, such as this one from ASPI, were rather hidden during the Christmas season. These reports all state that it is almost certain that Australia will not receive any Virginia-class submarines. There has been no real comment from either side of Parliament on these reports. There is actually a worse scenario than not getting the Virginias, and that is actually getting them. And I'm surprised this hasn't been discussed more widely. The Yanks will be short at least 4 Virginias before we were supposed to get one. If the Americans actually provide us with 3 Virginias, then the US Navy will be short nearly 10 boats from its own requirements. The problem is, as I've previously noted, even if Australia does get any Virginias, we are unlikely to get the new models, or blocks as they are called. Still, no matter their age, they are one of the most powerful warships ever built, so to an extent that is not a problem. However, the older the ship, the more maintenance and spare parts it needs, which brings us right back to US build capacity. If they can't build the components for new submarines, they certainly don't have the build capacity for spares, and that is exactly what is happening. The US Navy is actually cannibalizing older Virginias to provide enough spare parts to keep as many at sea as possible, especially as some of the components are lasting years less than was expected. So if we get the Virginias, then we will get older submarines with components at or nearing the end of their actual lives. These boats will require increased maintenance while competing with the US Navy for spare parts. Guess who'll win? In the process of buying lemons, the price we will pay will subsidise the production of brand new Virginias for the US Navy. You can see why the AUKUS program is so popular with the Americans. Many commentators have danced around one simple fact. It's perhaps because they don't want to face it. It is also perhaps because they, like me, believe the US Navy is a shield that has protected us from chaos. Therefore, they do not want to say the obvious, but I'm going to call it. The decline of the US naval submarine fleet is as terminal as was the collapse of the Soviet Navy. There will always be US Navy submarines, but the days of it dominating the world's oceans are fast ending. The facts are simple. The Los Angeles class boats still make up half of their fleet. At current build rates, the US Navy will not replace the last Los Angeles until about 2040, and that date is doubtful. As impressive as the LA boats are, the fact is that each boat will be approaching close to half a century of service before they are replaced. Quite simply, they are more likely to be dry docked, even scrapped, before there is a replacement. There is also another procurement crisis brewing for Australia, separate to the Virginias. Because of this focus on the submarines, a rather important side note was missed. That is, the lack of US shipbuilding capacity has dramatically impacted the size of the Royal Australian Navy as recommended under the Surface Fleet Review. Specifically, the production of the LUSV, as the Americans call them, has slipped by at least 2 years in the US. In my presentation on defence procurement, I had the RAN receiving its first LUSV, as we call them, in 2027. This was an error, as apparently the delivery schedule had already slipped to the mid-30s. In fact, 2027 is now the year the Americans only expect to start building their first ship for the United States Navy, so it's already slipped 2 years. Australia obviously cannot build them earlier, as our LOSVs were supposed to piggyback off the American project. However, despite the fanfare, our LOSV project is so badly delayed they are not even funded in the Australian defence budget. It is now quite probable that Australia will not get an LOSV until the late 2030s, and even that delivery time frame appears unlikely. Quite simply, the delays in the US Navy builds results from problems with finalising the design and manufacturing facilities. These delays are magnified in Australia because we can't even start before the Americans get it right. Nor is there enough build capacity in the US to provide LOSVs for both their Navy and ours. At the moment, with at least 15 years before we get the first ship, the Royal Australian Navy's LOSV project is best described as 2024's thought bubble of the year. There is another issue around workforce management that also has an interesting outcome, one that is again widely ignored. The Americans, not surprisingly, are dramatically expanding their workforce because their shipbuilding program, and especially submarine builds, are so far behind schedule that they can't catch up on their building schedule until their workforce is in place. Obviously, this means they need highly skilled workers today. The quickest way is to poach foreign specialists, but those specialists also have to pass fairly stringent security checks. The biggest and easiest source is the security vetted 10,000 currently employed in the UK, plus the workforce we are training up, who may well jump ship, especially if there are any questions about ongoing employment. This is actually an important issue in the viability of AUKUS. This is a chart of the major events that will or will probably affect Australian defence procurement. I'll be discussing them in greater detail later in the presentation. There are 3 events that I will highlight at this stage. I've already noted that we are unlikely to receive any Virginias. However, even if the Australian government believes or hopes that it will take place, there is another hurdle. The final approval for the sale of the Virginia-class submarines must be made in 2030 by a new president. My understanding is that, under US legislation, it cannot be made sooner. Until that approval is given, we cannot get the Virginias, but our defence procurement will have to budget for their purchase. The other is 2029, which is the year of the new president's inauguration, but also the final year for the UK election. The previous year, 2028, is the final year for an election that must be held in Australia. There is, yet again, talk of a 4-year term for Australian Parliament. However, in relation to defence procurement, it is completely irrelevant. In general, I'll focus on the top section for the years to 2029. You may wish to pause the presentation and have a look. We also need to look at finance first, because defence budgets exist in the real world, and it is finance which will decide many of the decisions I will look at. It is widely reported that interest payments on America's national debt, which stands at 123% of its GDP, is now greater than the defence budget. The UK will reach the impressive milestone of owing more than its GDP in 2025. Australia's debt at 34% seems financially much better. However, as always, it is a little more complex than these figures. The UK's defence budget is a comparatively smaller percentage because its national budget is directly responsible for education, health, etc. In Australia and America, the states carry a large amount of this financial burden, so we can spend a much greater percentage of the national budget on defence. That percentage is around 6.5% in Australia and 13% in the US, compared to 5.7% for the UK. Note that, despite defence spending in the UK being lower than Australia's as a percentage of the national budget, the UK actually spends about 15% more than Australia on defence as a percentage of its GDP. Just as for America, interest payments in the UK not only exceed the defence budget, but, unlike America, it actually dwarfs it. Interest payments now make up 8.4% of their total budget. In other words, the UK spends nearly twice as much on interest for its debts than it does on defence. I've changed the percentages for Australia and the US to match the ratio for the UK. As you can see, in the US, it would nearly double and this ratio would be at crisis levels. Debt repayments and defence expenditure would take nearly $1 out of every $3 in their federal budget. In Australia, it would nearly triple. This comparison gives a better understanding of the financial problems the British are having, and they are only growing worse. All this means that, financially, the UK is the weakest link of the AUKUS partners. These are the average costs for each type of submarine. I'm looking next at the British, so it's important to note that the UK already has a sovereign shipbuilding facility and also has an existing nuclear reactor manufacturing plant, so their costs should be significantly lower. How much lower is a big unknown. However, if the AUKUS final price for the UK is around $20 billion, then it is an astonishing 600% of the cost of their existing Astute submarine. Obviously, if successful, the AUKUS will have different and in many ways superior capabilities to the Astute submarines. That's not debatable. However, the question is whether the Royal Navy can justify AUKUS as a new generation submarines that the UK really needs. This debate about what the Royal Navy needs will become increasingly important over the next 5 years, especially in the face of financial constraints. So it is really important for Australia to understand whether the UK actually needs the AUKUS submarines. The Royal Navy's Astute submarines are built at the Barrow in Furness shipyards, and it is a shipyard where they are also building the dreadnoughts. This is also the shipyard that will build the British AUKUS submarines. As in Australia, the government emphasis is not on defence needs, but jobs. Their announcements include expanding the shipyard's workforce from 10,000 to 17,000. You can see from this chart that the Starmer government has an interesting dilemma with this announcement. Even if the last Astute is delayed to the year following its current delivery date and the AUKUS submarine production is commenced on time, there is a minimum of 2 years, almost certainly 3, and quite probably 4 or more years between the end of the Astute production and the beginning of the AUKUS production. The British, far from growing their workforce, will, in the years leading up to the next election, probably look at a contracting workforce. There is only one option to maintain the shipbuilding workforce developed for the Astutes, and that, of course, is to keep producing the Astutes. So I'm going to look now at what the Royal Navy actually needs. Operationally, there are 4 major areas for the Royal Navy. They are, in order, the North Atlantic, the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia. The Royal Navy has 7 attack submarines, of which 2 to 3 are normally available, though recently the Royal Navy has had none at sea. It was only at the beginning of 2025 that they actually managed to achieve 3 boats at sea, and their focus now is on Russian activity in the North Atlantic. At most, there is 1 submarine available for the remaining 3 zones, and its most likely area of operation is the Persian Gulf Red Sea. Rather interestingly, Royal Navy submarines in this zone are far closer to the new submarine facilities that we are building in Perth, rather than returning to the UK via the Cape of Good Hope. You can see the operational reason for rotating Royal Navy submarines through HMAS Stirling has very little to do with Southeast Asia. Due to geographic distances, the US Navy submarines in the Gulf have fairly similar operational needs for a major submarine facility in Perth, regardless of whether we have AUKUS. There are 5 basic roles for a Royal Navy warship that I'm going to summarise. Remember, I'm talking about the Royal Navy, not just its submarines. They are anti-ship, anti-submarine, anti-air, land attack, and protecting merchant shipping. Obviously, ships have multiple capabilities, but with a different emphasis based on their class. Some, like submarines, are entirely missing some capabilities. Where they are operating determines which ship is most suitable. Subjectively, this is my assessment for the 4 zones based on a rating of high, medium, and low. A little explanation. The military threat in the North Atlantic are Russian submarines. The role of Russia's surface fleet, following the lessons from Ukraine, is almost non-existent, so I'm being extremely generous just in giving it a low rating. The Royal Navy has, and probably will continue to do, limited ground strikes in the Western Med and the Gulf region. However, unlike the large numbers used by the Americans, it is more likely to be a series of limited and targeted ground strikes. This role and air defence is, realistically, while the Royal Navy built their aircraft carriers. It's only in the Far East, with any conflict with China, that their need for bulk launches of anti-ship and anti-surface missiles requires a VLS. Now I'm going to add a subsection on the submarines. This is the likely involvement of the Royal Navy's Astute submarines in these roles. Note that I'm not assessing their capabilities, but rather the importance of their capabilities in these regions. Note also that I am ignoring the role in defending merchant ships from other submarines, as I have listed their ASW capabilities separately. I accept that this is subjective and open to debate. The Royal Navy submarines do not need VLS in the North Atlantic. The likelihood of it needing to use that capability against surface ships or land targets is almost non-existent, and if Allied air is so depleted as to be unable to carry out strikes, probably irrelevant. It is a similar reality in the Western Mediterranean. As I've noted, any land strikes in the in the Red Sea and Gulf region by the Royal Navy is likely to be a small number of precision strikes as opposed to a large number of missiles as is done by the US Navy, so the absence of VLS is again not crucial. Once again, the only area VLS is needed is Southeast Asia, which is actually the Royal Navy's lowest priority. Yes, the lack of VLS hurts their ability to engage in large-scale naval engagements or land strikes. However, much like the prelude to Pearl Harbor, what the UK wants to do, but what the Royal Navy actually can do, will prove vastly different in the face of 2 major opponents, even if one is just a threat. Just as the pre-Second World War plan to send the home fleet to defeat the Japanese was a fool's dream, the reality is that the Royal Navy is unlikely to have more than 1 boat in this region and can perhaps surge another boat in an emergency. However, its primary focus must remain on any threat from Russia. It's not an unreasonable question to ask whether the extra capabilities the AUKUS submarines provide to the Royal Navy are worth upwards of an extra $15 billion per sub. Note that the priority for the Royal Navy submarines is ASW in the North Atlantic. However, due to the reduction in the strength of the Russian submarine fleet, this threat actually seems significantly reduced. So, in theory, Royal Navy submarines are available for use around the world. This is a mistaken understanding of their primary role, so that role needs a proper discussion before I talk about why the extra capabilities of the AUKUS submarines are no longer needed by the Royal Navy, certainly not for the cost. I'm going to start in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. The Soviets had around 100 nuclear-powered attack and cruise missile submarines available for operations in the North Atlantic. They probably had more than this number in conventional submarines, though they were primarily to defend the so-called bastions and for use in the Baltic. How many were available at any one time is unknown, but readiness was much lower than Western navies because of incompetence and corruption. Obviously, nothing much has changed. As can be seen, the size of the Russian submarine fleet has dropped quite dramatically. Another point is that all but one of their submarine classes date from the 60s and 70s. Even the Astute class started development under the Soviet Union and predates the Royal Navy Astutes by about a decade. In raw numbers, the US Navy and Royal submarines actually outnumber the Russian submarines by more than 2 to 1. Russian readiness, even ignoring corruption and lack of funding, would be much slower than Western navies simply due to the age of most of their submarines. The change in numbers is such that, in theory, as I said, the Royal Navy can again project power around the world. Arguably, that is one reason why it built its aircraft carriers. However, power projection has not been the core role of the Royal Navy for nearly half a century. In fact, the Royal Navy became the sole means of protecting the UK from nuclear blackmail or retaliation against nuclear attack by Russia. The core role of the Royal Navy now is providing the UK's only nuclear deterrent, and it is remarkably fragile. That nuclear deterrent consists currently of the 4 aging Vanguard SSBNs armed with Trident missiles. 4 new Dreadnought-class submarines will replace the Vanguards. This is scheduled to begin in 2028, but by then the Vanguards will already have reached the end of their service life. Any delays will only add to the cost and difficulty of keeping the Vanguards at sea, and for this reason the Dreadnought program will take precedence over any other construction, and that means AUKUS. Under the rule of 3, and because of their age, it is doubtful whether the Royal Navy can regularly keep more than 1 Vanguard at sea. Even when they are replaced by the Dreadnoughts, it is unlikely they can keep more than 2 at sea. The UK's nuclear deterrent is completely dependent on keeping at least 1, preferably 2, submarines safe at sea where they can avoid their greatest risk, which is being found. The Royal Air Force can largely protect them from any Russian aircraft used for anti-submarine warfare, which leaves Russian submarines as their greatest threat. This is not the place to discuss the myriad scenarios that the Royal Navy could face, whether it is in peacetime, so-called grey zone warfare, in any crisis situation, or even an actual outbreak of war. Suffice to say, the only true nightmare for the Admiralty is the loss of the UK's nuclear deterrent, either through the actual loss of a submarine or, perhaps even worse, due to the inability to keep a submarine at sea. Given the number of ASW assets the UK has, remembering that it is almost never the actual number available, the Astutes clearly play a major role in protecting the UK's nuclear deterrent. Again, under the rule of 3, they will usually only have 2 to 3 Astutes at sea at any one time, and making sure the Vanguards and Dreadnoughts are safe is their first, second and third priority. That's the military statistics. Now it's time to go back to the UK's finance. The British have an unusual budgeting system which they list their procurement program and assess whether they are affordable. This is part of the table provided by the Ministry of Defence. It was reviewed by their National Audit Office, who found that up until 2033, the British budget for new equipment is shy about $3 billion per year. The Starmer government must either cut existing programs or raise defence spending to over 2.5% of GDP to cover this shortfall. Such an increase would face resistance within his own party. The forecasted procurement budget deficit, if it doesn't blow out further, will max out in 2029 at a combined yearly total of about $43 billion before it supposedly starts to balance. Of course, 2029 is when Starmer must call a new elections. Games can be played. Until 2029, the UK procurement deficit can be hidden, as so often happens in Australia, by delaying major projects. However, no matter and regardless of whether it is Starmer, the UK government at the start of the new term in 2029 will have to make hard choices. Simply catching up will require a massive increase in the defence budget of about 5% in real terms, or about $6 billion in today's money. This would bump up their defence spending to between 2.6 and 2.7% of GDP, but given cost overruns associated with delayed projects, perhaps as high as 2.8%. And that's before the real cost of the AUKUS program kicks in 2030. The new Starmer government ignored all previous defence policy and commenced their own strategic defence review within a fortnight of Starmer's appointment as PM. There are some reports that the government rejected at least some of the draft recommendations in the briefing by the author of their DSR in late 2024. He actually told them to have another go. So much for independence. The problem for Starmer is that the government is committed to updating the UK's nuclear deterrent, the dreadnoughts, and the associated programs. The review undoubtedly, and quite rightly, would also emphasise the conventional threat by Russia, which means spending on the weapons needed for a ground war in Europe. That is, drones, tanks, anti-air of all types, and cruise missiles. Unfortunately, in terms of cost, and in a rather depressing way, it is actually cheaper for Starmer to commit to AUKUS now rather than invest in the Army or Air Force. By committing to AUKUS, he looks tough on defence, win votes in the local electorate, but the costs associated with AUKUS only really start increasing around 2030. Therefore, it is a problem left till after the next election, whereas spending in conventional weaponry would explode almost immediately, and he would need to find billions more for these types of acquisitions starting this year. However, the minimum of a 2-year delay between the start of the building of the AUKUS submarines and the construction of the last Astute will result in the collapse of the jobs in the submarine docks, just as the UK goes to those same poles, which brings us back to building at least one more Astute as a replacement for the older boats. If that happens, and it is seen as a good option, then it is not unreasonable for the British to keep the Astute program going and simply replace older boats with newer builds. This puts the AUKUS program at risk. The question is whether it can be sold to the British public. There are numerous articles such as this praising the Astute, especially in comparison to the Virginia-class submarines. Personally, I think these kind of discussions are largely irrelevant. The two submarines have significantly different roles, and in the North Atlantic, they complement each other. The main difference is their size. American boats try to be all things to everybody, but it means the latest Virginia blocks have the upgraded VLS that provides a massive amount of firepower. This article also states the Virginias are more difficult to maintain than the Astutes. The reason is fairly obvious. In trying to be everything to everyone, the Virginias are bigger and have more critical systems than the Astutes. More importantly, despite the Astutes being easier and therefore cheaper to maintain, the Royal Navy is finding it very difficult to keep enough at sea. Again, because the Royal Navy only has 7 submarines, the availability of each ship is really quite an important requirement. Although there is absolutely no proof, because the submarine doesn't exist, it is not unreasonable to say that the added complexity of the multi-role AUKUS submarine will reduce their availability compared to the Astutes. So what option does the UK have instead of AUKUS? Or more correctly, why would the Starmer government extend the Astute program to 2029 by ordering another build? The benefits are the additional ship is a nominal cost to the UK defence budget in the life of this Parliament. It is a continuation of the construction program and therefore preserves jobs in a marginal seat. The new Astute would replace the oldest Astute that has reached the end of its service life. This would happen at least 4 years earlier than waiting for an AUKUS submarine. The Astute is more than capable of performing its core role. It delays the decision on whether to proceed with AUKUS to the winner of the 2029 election. An Astute-class submarine costs $3 billion as opposed to upwards of $18 billion for the AUKUS based on Australian forecasted costs during the construction phase. The decision to proceed with AUKUS, therefore, is left till after the next election. Even if we get past the 2029 crunch, we still have 6 Australian elections and at least 2 new presidential administrations to go before we start building a submarine. It's a big call. The Americans have actually already made the same decision with the next generation submarine for the US Navy. It was originally supposed to commence production in 2035, but is now put back by upwards of a decade, perhaps longer. Instead, America has decided to scale up production of the Virginia class, otherwise there would be too much pressure on its build capacity. It also should not be forgotten that the UK's actual financial commitment to the AUKUS program is, politely, tenuous. Of the $8 billion the UK is investing in upgrades for shipyards and nuclear reactor manufacturing, over half this funding, or $5 billion, is actually from Australia. The Starmer government, in announcing the contract, failed to mention the funding arrangement with Australia. Meanwhile, the actual British commitment to the development of the AUKUS submarine at $250 million is little more than seed funding. It only starts to ramp up in, you guessed it, late 2029. President Trump's administration will end at the beginning of 2029 with the inauguration of the next president, while by the April of that same year, the UK must have another election. That British government must commit to building an AUKUS submarine later that same year because it has to give 12 months notice to withdraw from the agreement by 2030. In terms of Britain's commitment to AUKUS, 2029 is the crucial year, and by 2029, Australia would have had 2 more elections. Once again, I'm going to call it. The VLS adds nothing to the Royal Navy's core role of being and protecting the UK's sole nuclear deterrent. The increased complexity of the AUKUS submarines must result in difficulties in keeping the boats at sea. The Royal Navy, with only 7 boats, has barely enough capacity under the rule of 3 to keep 2 boats at sea, and they're struggling now. In fact, at the moment, in total they only have 5 boats, and last year managed a remarkable feat of having no boats at sea for 100 days. They simply do not have the margin for a boat that is too difficult and expensive to keep at sea. While the admirals in the Royal Navy, like the admirals in all Navy, want all the toys, the reality is that the Royal Navy does not need the extra capabilities and maintenance costs of the AUKUS submarines. In fact, given the UK's strategic situation and the competing priorities under its defence budget, it's a waste of money. Firstly, there is a delay between the end of the Astute program and the start of the AUKUS, leaving the construction program in a hiatus. Then when the cost of the AUKUS budget really starts to hit the UK's defence budget in 2030, the really smart thing is for them to walk away. Whether they do so is a big question, but they do have at least one option. Honestly, I don't think it's possible for Australia to manage this risk, and we will have to rely on blind luck. If the UK is the risk that Australia simply can't do anything about, then the US is the ally that we seem incapable of managing. Every democracy has outlier politicians, the ones that oppose everything and promote the impossible or even the objectionable. Generally, they don't have a voice, and your country's friends and allies just ignore them. It's a little harder to do when the survival of a minority government is reliant upon those outliers, and the government has to negotiate with them. The Greens are profoundly anti-American, so a minority government reliant upon their support will mean the US will take notice of their pronouncements. In terms of Australia's strategic risk management, President Trump is the wild card that the Albanese government seems completely incapable of managing. Bluntly, keeping Kevin Rudd as the Australian ambassador to the United States is a display of counterproductive incompetency rarely seen in international statesmanship outside of China's wolf warrior diplomats. The remarkable work by Starmer's Secretary of State and Britain's old ambassador to the United States in building a relationship with the Trump administration makes Australia's efforts look pathetic in comparison. And then, unsurprisingly, the UK replaced her with a party hack by the name of Mandelson, largely because of internal party politics, and everything they've done to date fell apart. The lesson for Australia's diplomatic relations with the US is clear. Maintaining strong diplomatic relationships with the US is far more important than our internal party politics, and this is a lesson both major parties have to learn. Having said that, there are several factors under a Trump administration that cloud the future of the AUKUS program. You can pause and have a read and probably add a few of your own. Notably, they can be summed up in 3 points. Firstly, AUKUS is far more important to Australia than it is to America, and by such an incredible degree that it goes beyond being a bargaining chip to that of an extreme negotiating advantage for the Trump administration. Secondly, management of personalities within the Trump administration is crucial. To date, that is something many Australian politicians and senior bureaucrats seem incapable of understanding. Failure to support the US against China on any diplomatic dispute would probably prove a deal breaker, as potentially would other issues where the Trump administration expects its close allies to stand up and be counted. What would have happened under the Trump administration if we had abandoned our own bipartisan support of Israel, as we did under Biden? Finally, there is no financial cost or procurement delays resulting from the US walking away from AUKUS. In fact, they are better off, as the $5 billion Australian investment in submarine shipyards is apparently unconditional. The AUKUS costs and the risks of the program are primarily borne by Australia, and the obligation is on us to make sure it succeeds. Apart from AUKUS, what does all this mean for Australia? Australia will face 2 elections by 2029, with the first in 2025, no more than 3 months after this presentation is posted. Many pundits are forecasting a minority government following this election, though this is starting to look less likely. Time will tell. Regardless of whether this happens, the growth of fundamentalist parties, both ideological and religious, will undoubtedly change the nature of Australia's parliament, and we will inevitably see minority governments in which these parties have the balance of power. The most likely government in Australia will be a Labor government, relying upon the Greens Party and other crossbenchers, and they will have a serious impact upon defence procurement in Australia. Of the minor parties, only the Greens actually have a defence party. I am from here going to ignore all the silly stuff and focus more on the financial side, except that I would note that both the GP frigates and LOSV programs are banned under their policy statements. However, just because they have a defence policy doesn't mean we'll have any direct say in defence procurement and planning. A bipartisan defence policy prevents too much direct interference, but they will have a say in general government expenditure, and that's where it gets interesting. As I stated, there is still a great deal of bipartisanship on the need to invest in the ADF because of changes to Australia's strategic situation. All the major parties are committed to AUKUS. The issue for them is about ensuring the program is completed, not whether it should go ahead. However, the commitments to the procurements required for the DSR means the cost of defence will increase from 2% of GDP to 2.3% of GDP, and this increase will likely start this year and really bite in 2027-28. This increase is completely opposed by the Greens. Is completely opposed by the Greens, who, in fact, demand a massive reduction in defence spending. At this point, let me repeat something I've said previously and in my book. A commitment to a specific percentage of GDP causes nothing but waste and inefficiencies. Australia should spend what is required based around what is happening in our region and the strategic threats we face or will imminently face. My personal opinion is that we need to both get the cost of defence acquisitions back under control and increase spending to create the defence force we will need. Having said that, there is clearly a minimum that needs to be spent on defence to just maintain the ADF. The Greens simply refuse to even consider that minimum. Senator Jordan Steele-John, who is not the Green spokesman on defence, announced a cap of 1.5% of GDP. Senator Shoebridge, who is actually their defence spokesman, has not expressed an opinion. Adam Brandt, the party leader, also supports the 1.5% figure, and although the defence policy in the lead up to the 2025 election is mysteriously unavailable, it apparently remains the case. Regardless, I'm having a bit of trouble at this time. Regardless, like the bipartisan commitment to AUKUS, the Greens spending cap on defence is simply not going to happen, but that's not really the issue. The real issue is that there's going to be a great deal of horse trading with a minority government. Each player will push their pet projects, and some of the amounts we are talking about are really quite extraordinary. What this means is instability in government and government spending, as well as potentially massive economic and social disruptions and a weak economy. What this instability means for defence is best defined as policy and procurement paralysis. This paralysis will prove to be a disaster if we get a minority government in 2025, and in fact was pretty much what happened under the Gillard government. Of course, this paralysis will also put pressure on any bipartisan defence policy, not least because this is the one remaining major policy area in which there is actually still bipartisanship. Cheap shots will be made by politicians on both sides, Positions will be taken, then hardened, and the deep political schism in Australian society will only reinforce the paralysis on defence policy. While I have repeatedly made it clear that I am not a fan of AUKUS, the reality is that we no longer have any choice under the DSR. Yet, the commitment to AUKUS must survive at least 6 elections before we get the first AUKUS submarine. Once again, I am not sure it is possible. Interestingly, I made the same point in my book when I was discussing any nuclear weapons program for Australia. We would need a bipartisan agreement before it could be started, and that agreement would have to last 10 to 20 years. It was my opinion that the agreement would not last long enough. In the middle of the next term of government, that is 2027, AUKUS expenditure will really take off, with it growing to $6 to $7 billion, including the contingency fund. The 2027-28 forward estimates requires an actual 10% increase in the defence budget in just 1 year. However, the timing of the increase will see the government have to justify this increase for the 2028 election. Obviously, if there is no actual increase in the acquisition budget, other projects will face serious delays, even cancellations. As an example, the other 28 in the top 30 acquisition projects will require funding of around $50 billion before they are completed. If there is no increase in the defence budget, and we do not take on another single acquisition project, it would be 2030 before we simply pay for what we have already ordered, and we can only achieve that time frame if the budget for all these programs are kept under control. Given the paralysis associated with a minority government, the budget is unlikely to increase anywhere near the needed amount, so the government has to look at savings, and the biggest projects where they can find these savings are in acquisitions for the Navy. However, note that the sustainment budget actually exceeds the acquisition budget before then. Savings can be found in the sustainment budget in the form of less training, infrastructure builds, and estate management. This means reducing the time ships are at sea and planes are in the air. Equally, the age of both the Collins-class submarines and the Anzac frigates means they are far more expensive to keep at sea, plus the expensive upgrades needed to keep them ready for contemporary warfare. In a rather roundabout way, the impact of the AUKUS program under minority government may lead to a serious decline in the effectiveness of all 3 branches of the ADF well before we get a single submarine. This shows what I mean if we can't get any real increase in the defence budget. This year's budget for defence acquisition was $16.5 billion, and I'm going to use it as a base. I'll show the cost of 3 programs as a percentage of this budget for the next 10 years to give you an idea of the scale, the increasing scale of their expenditure. The 3 programs are AUKUS, of course, which can't be varied, and the Hunter and GP frigates, which can be varied. I've rounded down to provide as favourable percentage as possible. So let's begin with 2025. The AUKUS program is estimated to cost at least $6 billion per year for the next decade, so I'll keep it at that amount, though I think it will actually increase. The first Hunter is under construction, but it will take 8 years, so I've given an average value of $750 million per year, which is actually what Defence has budgeted for this year. This means these 2 programs alone are 40% of the baseline budget. The government wants the first GP frigate in 2029, which means construction needs to start in 2026. The cheaper option is the German frigate. The last contract for its ships was in 2018. The Egyptian Navy ordered 4 at a total cost of close to $4 billion Australian. I'm not sure how the government thinks we'll get 11 frigates for as little as $7 billion. In fact, there are already reports that Defence is changing the design. Personally, I would not be surprised if the initial contract is well over $1 billion per ship. I've been generous and put the average yearly cost as $300 million. That increases, that's per year for per ship, that increases the 2026 acquisition budget to 42% of the baseline. 2027 sees another GP frigate, and these 3 programs have hit 44% of the baseline. 2028 sees the 3rd GP frigate starting construction. As there will never be more than 3 GP frigates in construction, their yearly cost should max out, but they don't. We will also see another Hunter go into the pipeline. The 3 programs have now passed 50% of the baseline. 2028 is interesting. In theory, the GP frigates will now be built in Australia. The ANO puts a premium for doing so at 30% for the Hobart-class destroyers, but that premium has grown dramatically since then. However, being generous, I'll just use a 30% premium. This causes a marginal increase over the next few years. In 2031, at the latest, the third Hunter build will start, so the average yearly cost for both the Hunters and GP frigates will hopefully max out. Combined, the three programs will max out at 57% of the baseline, and I'm being incredibly generous. Based on historical performances by our Defence Department, you could probably add at least another 10%. In 6 years, these three projects alone will cost up to 2/3 of this year's entire acquisition budget. If there is no real increase in the acquisition budget, the pressure on all other acquisitions, as well as the sustainment budget, will be catastrophic. I've drastically shortened this section on Australia, mainly because this discussion on naval procurement was and is depressing, but also it's largely irrelevant to the problem stemming from AUKUS. The Hunter-class frigates don't count because we are not getting the first one until the end of this 10-year period. The decision on the second batch of three doesn't have to be made until 2032. The GP frigates are much more of a problem. Overseas construction was supposed to start next year. The Germans are currently producing one ship a year for the Egyptians, and this contract will be completed in 2025. In theory, they can start producing a frigate for the Royal Australian Navy in 2026 for delivery on schedule. Conversely, the Japanese are already building 2 frigates per year, ending in 2028. In theory, they can't start building for the Australian Navy until 2029, which is way outside the timeframe announced by the government. However, the Japanese are very keen to develop a strategic partnership with Australia. They are willing to extend their own shipbuilding program and instead build 1 ship a year to Australia starting on schedule. This would mean only 1 per year for their own Navy instead of the planned 2, so it's quite an extraordinary offer. The issue is that the approval has to happen at the beginning of this year for there to be any real possibility of starting construction on time. However, as I noted, there is already talk of design changes, which the Japanese can only achieve by completing their Navy's orders first. So that counts them out if we demand design changes. It is also difficult to see how the Germans can commence a building program until any design changes are finalised. While the contract may be signed, it's anybody's guess when we will actually get the frigates. Way to go, Defence. The most important thing I'm trying to show is the interplay between the rising cost of these programs and the Australian electoral cycle. Early 2028 is the latest in which the election after this one can be held. Note the massive increase in the cost of these 3 programs, which is what many would call a poison pill for whoever forms that government. If there is no significant increase in the acquisition budget until under a 2025 minority government, then the cost of that poison pill will dramatically increase. This again emphasises one of the more interesting aspects of the naval shipbuilding programs in both Australia and the UK. It is the announce now, pay later defence procurement policy. Effectively, you look tough on defence while putting the real costs off well into the future, and of course, someone else's problem. Okay, this is a long slide because it's a little bit in depth. What is really interesting about the Australian shipbuilding program is actually the legacy ships. I've seen silly stuff that surface ships and submarines can be kept long past their forecasted service life. At face value, that's true. The reality is vastly different. The older the vessel, the more maintenance required to keep it at sea. Major refits are required both for safety reasons, especially for submarines, and because of increasingly obsolescent systems. This means additional expense, but perhaps more importantly, less time at sea. The rule of 3 gets broken. A simple way of expressing the rule of 3 for a ship is that for every 4 months at sea, there is 4 months in port for minor maintenance and repairs, and 4 months for major repairs or upgrades. The rule of 3 applies to vessels within their service life. As they age, it becomes the rule of 4, perhaps even the rule of 5. Under the rule of 4, it becomes for every 3 months of sea, there is now 9 months of minor and major repairs. That extra month of repairs actually increases the cost of maintaining the vessel by 1/3 for every month at sea. The alternative is to actually dry dock some ships of the class. In theory, as I've mentioned before, they are still listed as ships of the Navy, so the numbers remain good. According to the reports, this is what is happening to the Virginias. Some are being cannibalized to keep others at sea. The actual number dry docked is unknown because they remain on the roster. So we may have 5 Collins-class submarines on the fleet roster, but the number available will increasingly become 0. The real problem for the GP frigates is the Australian build. Labour shortages and manufacturing changes will undoubtedly add to the cost of the GP frigates, and perhaps to the build time, even without design changes. If the budget is under pressure, one option is to continue the overseas build, but the issue here is that the decision has to be made in the lead up to the 2028 elections, lost votes locally and perhaps even nationally. It's anybody's guess what will be the outcome. A more expensive build and later deliveries, or cheaper overseas built ships delivered on time. Interestingly, and this will not be part of the negotiations but should be considered, the German boat is purely a commercial exchange. When the Australian build goes over budget, they will simply make us pay. Conversely, the Japanese may be willing to absorb any extra costs simply because of their desire for a strategic partnership. Of the two competitors, the Japanese ship is about the only way we are going to get all the GP frigates for that $10 billion. This all means the Royal Australian Navy will be in a dreadful state pending the arrival of the AUKUS submarines that only start in about 20 years. However, the crunch will come well before then. In 2034, 10 years from now, and the end of the period looked at by this presentation, this is what the Royal Australian Navy surface combat fleet, plus the submarines, was supposed to look like. There was supposed to be another 5 Hunters, there are another 5 Hunters, 5 GP frigates, and 5 LOSVs that are still to be built at this time. Even then, I've been generous, as a Hunter timetable will undoubtedly slip. However, in reality, we're not getting the LOSVs, or hopefully not getting any second-hand Virginias. The number of Collins-class submarines does go back up to 6, but due to their age, it will be difficult to keep more than one at sea. They will also lose their surge capacity, which is the number of boats they can put to sea in a crisis. Normally, under the rule of 3, you could expect up to 4 boats to be put to sea in an emergency. The Collins will mostly be in dry dock, so in a crisis you may be able to put 2 boats to sea, if that. The Surface Fleet Review gave the Navy a force of 9 Tier 1 ships, 11 Tier 2 ships, and 6 LOSVs. In 10 years' time, Australia will only have 4 Tier 1 ships, 6 Tier 2 ships, and no LOSVs. After a decade, and at between $50 and $60 billion, we will have managed to halve the number of Tier 1 and Tier 2 ships. Out of a forecasted roll call of 26 surface combatants, we will have 10, and perhaps be able to main one aged diesel submarine at sea at any one time. Finally, due to the horse trading associated with minority governments, there is no guarantee we'll get the very overpriced second option of 3 more Hunters. If this happens, then the project cost of the Hunters will be $9 billion per ship. It is an absurd amount. It is already more. Even if we built 6 ships, the average is still more than the price of the US Navy replacement for their cruisers. If only 3 are built, it will make it the most expensive surface combatant ever built, excluding America's supercarriers. It will prove a record price that will probably stand for the rest of human history. It is extremely difficult to see how the major political parties can manage all the risks to the AUKUS program, but manage them they must do. The reality is that the DSR is simply a blueprint for failure without the AUKUS submarines. However, all the international and domestic electoral cycles, combined with the strategic needs of our allies, point to the program's failure. I'm going to end this presentation with a question that no one seems willing to ask. Why are we, to use a poker term, all in? We are currently developing a trained workforce for building a submarine whose construction will not start for nearly 20 years. We are even training Navy personnel in reactor management, even though they will have retired before any submarine is even built. I know the arguments, but this timetable seems absurd. All we appear to be doing is creating a security-vetted trained workforce to be poached by the Americans. Why is the submarine choice so absolute? Why do we not start building one of the proven conventional submarines as soon as possible? If we worked on a 2-year build cycle, even given the time to develop the manufacturing process, we could have a boat in the water at least by 2030. The workforce is employed and retained, the sovereign shipbuilding capacity is developed, and we could have 6 or 7 boats in the water before an AUKUS submarine is produced. These diesel boats will complement the AUKUS submarines, and it could even be replaced by the nuclear submarines, provided we ever get the chance to build them. Of course, we would need a new agency other than Defence. We need to get away from their sheer incompetence and find another way to get through this next 10 years. Now, thank you for listening. I know it's long and dry, and I appreciate you staying with me. I've only got 2 more presentations to come. The first one will come out hopefully before the end of March. The second one and final one is actually I'm actually doing another book that probably no one also will read, but hey, I'm enjoying it, which is on the lessons learnt for Australia from the Ukrainian conflict. And the presentation I'll do will be based on the chapter which relates to the maritime war in the Black Sea. Okay, thank you and have a good day.